Music junkies, welcome back. It is the Real Music Observer coming at you with more real music in real time for real people just like you, right there, and this guy here. Robert Lamm. Going to talk about Chicago's Robert Lamm. Now, before I get going, I've been inspired lately by this Leonid and Friends band from Russia who are performing all of this Chicago material mostly pre David Foster. They do, I know, one song from the Foster era, but some deep cuts, the title track from Hot Streets. I mean, this is a cool group. You got to go listen to it. And I think you'll dig it. Vocals, I'm not saying anybody sounds like anybody. Oh, heavens, I'm not going to compare vocalists. I'm just going to get skewered. Robert Lamm, though, I want to talk about what happened to Robert Lamm during the 1980s, as it's rumored that Robert went into kind of a depression, felt pretty much like his contributions weren't needed. Foster comes in on 16. Now, on Chicago 14, Robert Lamm, I believe, wrote or co-wrote 4 songs, and that's kind of his typical output. And then all of a sudden on 16, he's reduced to half a song. And that song, by the way, is Getaway, which ends up being a very nice ending to Hard to Say I'm Sorry. It's kind of like the yin and the yang there, and it's cool. Radio programmers who lop off that ending, shame. I know a lot of soft rock stations, they get nervous because Getaway is such this upbeat rockin' horn blast ending. And look, folks, the song's what, like 30-something years old. Just, I think it's okay to put that on, Sunny 95 or whatever radio station you're listening to. The point being is that Robert's contributions went from 4 to almost 0. Same thing happens on Chicago 17, where he's got 1, and then on 18 he's got like 1.5, and 19 he's got 1, and then he sings another one that was written, I believe, by Mark Jordan. So it was kind of like, where's Robert? Where's Robert? And Robert was really nowhere to be found. Foster, he placated everybody and said, hey, you want to sing this song that me and Peter wrote? Look, you can't, if you're a fan of the 80s Chicago, you can't really fault Foster, who was really kind of a period piece himself. In other words, David Foster belongs in the 80s. He doesn't belong in the 90s. He tried in the 70s and really didn't hit it until he did this thing called Airplay, which I think he made Chicago kind of sound like Airplay. If you go listen to the Airplay album, all of the little bells and whistles and production techniques. The Average White Band also has an album toward the very end of their catalog that sounds a lot like Chicago. Or it sounds like David Foster produced Chicago, if you know what I mean. And then Earth, Wind, and Fire. And you can kind of throw all that into a pot and say Foster made everybody sound like this. And I think Robert Lamm, being the pioneer, or one of the pioneers, along with Jimmy Pankow and Walt Perizzader, Lee Loughnane, these guys broke new ground. Even Danny Seraphin, who helped Robert co-write Thunder and Lightning on 14, I think had a completely different perspective. Now, supposedly, Danny was the one who said, hey, let's get Foster and Champlin and rework this and get this moving again. And in hindsight, was it a good idea? Sure. But for the hardcore Chicago fans who complained incessantly, because I was there, because I went to see Chicago on their 18 tour, number one, they had just lost Peter Cetera. Number two, they're all people there saying, oh, this isn't the Chicago I grew up with. Chicago 2, Fancy Colors on, this album, and going back to really, their more orchestral, movement-oriented music, which was almost classical in nature and complicated and jazzy and wasn't necessarily out there just for, hit single purposes. Those people were having a rough time during the 80s, and a lot of them just said, I'm done. I don't like this band anymore. I liked them prior to this David Foster sort of redone Chicago. And I think this took its toll on Robert Lamm because Robert Lamm was back in that era. He didn't adapt well to the 80s, is my opinion anyway. But it doesn't mean that his contributions couldn't have been reworked or used a little bit more. Chicago 21, I think there's some more Robert stuff on there, but they're still using a lot of these outside songwriters like Diane Warren. And by the time we get to Stone of Sisyphus, the album that wasn't released and one that was released a long time after that, finally came out a few years back, Robert Lamm had really kicked in with contributions. And notice the record label's like, nope, you're not releasing this album. It's the worst thing you've ever done. Go away. And that's kind of what happened. Then they did the Big Band album. And subsequent albums, by the way, have featured still this formula, of Champlin being there and Jason being there. We're going to focus on those guys. Maybe we'll give one to Robert. It wasn't until the very last Chicago album, the Now album, as I like to call it, that one featured some really great Robert Lamm music. That's probably the best Robert Lamm music since, the late 70s or mid 70s. He's got some great songs on there, along with the other guys in the band, but Robert's contributions have definitely come back. I'm hoping they'll actually record some new music and, again, put Robert and Jimmy at the center. Let these guys write. I don't know about these new guys, if they can write music or not. They tend to be, or at least the new singer tends to be covering everybody's stuff. So, bottom line, if you're a Chicago fan, you have to understand that David Foster, I believe, had a lot to do with Robert Lamb's demise to some degree. Because, again, you're talking about a pioneer who helped really design and was a chief architect of the sound of Chicago from the late 60s to the late 70s and even up to 1980. I mean, Thunder and Lightning, just give it a spin. That's just a gem of a song. Could be my favorite song by Chicago from the 1980s because it sounds like Chicago and it's got just a humongous hook. And, maybe we hit a little bit of a songwriting snag on that album for the rest of the album, but if you had a record label at that point devoted to the band, they were probably still in shock of, Terry Kath passing and the last two albums not doing as well, but Hot Streets and Chicago 13, I think, are great albums, and people need to go back and listen to those records because there's some good grooves on there. So, in any event, I'm Dave. I'm the Real Music Observer. I'll be back talking about more real music in real time for real people just like you, just like me. And, Robert Lamm, a pioneer, and hopefully he's got more new music in there somewhere, and we'll see new Chicago music someday. All right, talk to you soon, everybody.